I'm going to talk about open core for a couple of reasons. One is that I think we're facing some changes in how we define open source, and the subject of open core has been very prominent in the last couple of years. But also, I think it's very unclear what open core is to many people. Like, as a consultant, I have a lot of companies who reach out to me and they say, we've got an open source project, or we're thinking about setting up an open core business, and we don't really know what we want to focus on and what we want to do. So the goal of this presentation is to really share my perspective on what the right balance of an open core project and business would look like. But this is by no means concrete in any way, shape, or form. This is just one person's perspective, and hopefully the start of a conversation. So there are many open core businesses out there. I was actually just talking, my buddy down here works at GitLab. I think GitLab are a really good example of this. And these are businesses where you've got an open source project that either just one business feeds into, or there may be a number of different people feed into. And then you've got a set of commercial products that usually sit on top of or around that. And as I mentioned just now, there's been a lot of pretty fervent criticism about open core. People such as Simon and Matt and various other people who will say this is just objectively a bad thing in the industry in many cases. There was a conference called the Open Core Summit that happened a little while ago that brought together a bunch of people to discuss this. There was some criticism at the summit about the topic, and there's a lot of criticism online. But what's interesting to me is that you see projects like Vault, I'm going to use HashiCorp as an example here, that have done really well. They're really popular projects, they've got a really healthy community and ecosystem wrapped around it, and then the business that's moving it forward has done really well. And a lot of people have really favorable things to say about, for example, HashiCorp. So there's clearly a good and a bad to this. And my view with these scenarios is I've never been a particularly religious person, so I don't believe that open core is either a great thing and great in every scenario, or a bad thing and bad in every scenario. To me, there's a balance that needs to be struck. It's like saying that open source is good or bad. If you apply the principles of open source and community well, then you can get great results, or you can completely screw it up. To me, what's interesting is that this is all about culture, right? There are these disparate cultures that are wrapped around everything that we do in the open source community. I found this. I remember seeing this a while back, which is the world of Linux distributions. And this seems pretty accurate to me. I think when I saw this, I was in the Ubuntu fortress. But what's interesting to me about open core is that we've got different cultural elements, and we haven't really defined what they are. So what you get is big parts of the world that are mapped out, and there's a fear of finding dragons, right? So what we're seeing in open core is businesses that are there to make money, open source projects that are there to create software, and what is the bridge between them. So in my mind, if you want to do open core well, the first thing you need to do is understand both sides of that equation and understand how you can bridge these different cultures. And bridging cultures is hard, but it's not impossible. You can absolutely do it. And we've seen many examples of this across open source, where different communities have come together to collaborate and do interesting things. So the way I look at it, and I'm going to just talk about open core here. I'm not here to talk about what is the best business model in open source. Friends like my friend Steve Wally would say there are no business models in open source. This is me just literally talking about open core. If you've basically decided that's what you're going to do. Now, to me, there's basically two sides of this equation. On one side, you've got the project. So when I say the word project here, what I mean is an open source project, something that probably lives in GitHub or GitLab. The code is open source, it's available. There's a community of people who invest and participate their time, they put their time into this project for the betterment of the users of the project. Then you've got products. And these are products that sit on top of or around it. So the project, for example, would be Vault, and the product would be Vault Enterprise. Okay? You'd have GitLab and GitLab Enterprise. And we've all seen many organizations that take this. To me, when figuring out how to make an open core project and product successful, it's about figuring out that piece of connective tissue in between. That's where the magic happens. So there are people out there who talk a lot about open core, and they only ever talk about the product. Like, how do you sell? How do you convert your open source users into customers? That's one thing to discuss and to consider, But to me, if you want to be successful and you want to avoid a lot of the problems that other people have experienced with open core, you need to get that bridge right. That is where the culture happens. Because if you get it wrong, what happens is you get a lot of really annoyed people on the project side who are like, this company are coming in and they're trying to take over and they're making really inappropriate decisions about our project, this, that, and the other. And on the product side, if you don't get the balance right, well, there's a bunch of whiny open source nerds out there who don't get the fact that we have to make money to be able to pay the bills. So we need to get that balance right. So what I'm going to present here are 6 key principles and some practical recommendations in how we do this. Now, this is not all of the key principles. This is just 6, I think, they're the most prevalent ways for people to start. And this is going to cover both the product side of things as well as the project. So my assumption here is that each of you folks is looking at this from the perspective of we need to make an open source project work and we want to make a business that wraps around it. So the first thing is, does the market and industry want your project and product? It's amazing how many companies I've talked to where they just come to the decision that, okay, well, if we have an open source project, by definition, we'll sell a load of products because open source is really popular. We can go and speak at events like KubeCon, and that's how it's going to work. Not true, okay? And I think you need to, first of all, make this decision. So in terms of defining this need, the first thing is that open source really isn't a panacea. It is not a solution to all of your problems. If you use it well and you understand the culture of open source and you bridge that with your business well, then you can do amazing things. And there are many examples of companies that have done that. But the first thing I think you need to do is say, is there a project-product market fit? So a lot of people talk about market fit assessments. I don't want to rant about Superhuman, but I started using this email client recently, Superhuman. These two, I know they're sick of me talking about it. But they actually wrote a really interesting piece about product market fit and how you segment your audience and you get feedback from your audience. And the people in the middle, the people who are not, some people don't particularly care about your product, some people care a lot. The people in the middle will make the suggestions and the value that will generate the kind of features that will be most appropriate for what your broader audience wants to accomplish. So I think looking at, does the project do something that the market wants, that the industry wants? Like, is it useful? And are people interested in buying a product that adds a layer on top of that? Okay? Now, a good example of this, I mean, I've talked with companies where they'll say, well, we think that the market will buy these kinds of facilities and services, and they actually have no data to back that up. So one area where a lot of people have been quite successful is a project that will, for example, where the commercial product is integrating that project into a business. So Mattermost, for example, have a completely free open source project, and Mattermost Enterprise will help you to integrate it with Active Directory and have authentication and all those different pieces. And that's the kind of thing that people will pay for. So you've got to evaluate whether you're actually building something the market's going to want. The other thing is, are they going to pay for it? It sounds obvious, but just because you think it's a good idea that this product does something unique, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are a group of people out there who are going to pay for it. So I'd recommend go and try and get as much research and data as possible to be able to validate that. Ask people if it's something they'd be interested in buying. Don't just build something first of all and then hope that people are going to buy it. Otherwise, there's a very real possibility that that won't happen. And the other element here is be clear what active participation looks like, and especially how does that work with competitors. So a lot of companies are very happy and excited about open core when they think, they're the primary people behind the project. But when you have an open source project, you may have other people contributing to it who are your competitors. People may fork it, and a lot of companies are underprepared in how to deal with that. And I think the truest open source and open core projects accept that competitors contributing to a project is a good thing. It's a market validation. It shows that the project has a broader set of worth. So what does that look like? And how are you going to define that in your company, make sure that everybody's clear with it? So the second area of 6, who are your target audience? Again, this might sound obvious, but it's amazing how many companies I've worked with that have never really been through this exercise. And there are loads of different audiences. And I tend to think of these as the main ones. So users are the people who are going to use your project, the open source project. Okay? So who are you going to define those people as being? Is it platform engineers? Is it security people? How do you define that? But then who are your customers? And typically this may be which markets and verticals are those people working in, who can write checks, because there's a lot of people who might want to buy your product, but they don't have any kind of ability to write a check and be able to pay for it. There's two types of developers that I like to define, inner and outer. So inner developers are the kind of people who contribute to an open source project. They write pull requests, they submit them, they're reviewed, they go into your project. And they typically need to have a great level of awareness about how your project works. And it's hard to find these people. Not everybody will become one of those intrinsic open source developers. The other type is outer developers. These are the people who will build technology that runs on top of your project. So it could be, for example, people who build WordPress plugins, or people who build extensions. These are two very different types of developer, right? With outer developers, most of them just want a really great platform, a simple SDK, great documentation, and to write code. They don't feel like they necessarily need to be involved in every individual decision that that project is making. Whereas with inner developers, people who participate in the project themselves, they need to feel like they're part of the team. And this is going to be something I mentioned later on. You do not want the staff in the company having there's a perception that they have a special, easier way of participating. You want to make sure that your contributors and the staff are as equally leveled out as possible. But the staff are being paid to do it, so they've got more time to contribute and play a role in that project. So these are two very different ways of building developer engagement. It's easier for outer developers and a lot harder for inner developers, especially if the company doesn't really have a sense of how open source projects tend to work. The second to last one, contributors. These are people who will contribute outside of engineering. So they'll write documentation, they'll organize meetups, they'll do community management, they'll do translations. And one of the things that I think is always important is you've got to prioritize which of these personas are the most critical ones to focus on. For example, if you want a lot of developers coming in and making your project better, then you want to focus on inner developers. But if you want massive levels of take-up, you might want to focus on users and outer developers as an example. So it's important to figure out who that's going to be. And then the final one is commercial partners. These are people who may be building products and services that kind of sit around it. It could be integrations, for example, with other platforms. And again, this is a very different type of audience. They need a different set of incentives and rewards and whatever else. So we've got to focus on what are the most critical ones with your particular business and project. So the third one, do you have open, accessible project infrastructure? Now, this is more on the project side than the product side, but I think this is really important for a number of different reasons. Again, one core philosophy that I've got with Open Core is if you can have a developer who is in the community, participates in the project, and you have another developer who is paid by the main company behind the project, and those two folks operate in exactly the same tools, have access to the same documentation, the same peer review and code review processes, they have the opportunity to go to the same events, the same meetings, the same communication channels, you're much more likely to have a happier, healthier open core project. If there is a divergence between them and the contributor in the project who isn't paid by the company operates as they do, but there's a whole set of meetings they don't know about, decisions that are made that they don't know about, if they feel like they're unpaid labor, you're going to have a tough time. So a big chunk of setting up your open infrastructure is making sure that those tools are in place. But what's more important is that you have the processes and the culture in the company to enforce it, to make that happen. So this will all start with an open source license. Okay? Now there's all kinds of questions around this, with like recent conversations about Redis and all these other projects. But at its base level, you need to make sure that the project is under an open source license. You need to make sure that there's open code issues and documentation. The way I look at it is there's kind of 4 priorities in terms of what needs to be open. Number 1 is code. You're not going to get very far unless the code is available in something like GitHub or GitLab. The second one is issues. You need a place where people can go and submit bugs, track features, have conversations about very specific pieces of work. That should be open. The only exception I would say here is going to be things like security issues, potentially. Sometimes you can't have a public issue where people are discussing a security vulnerability. And you may have a separate issue tracker for specific customer work. Like if you're doing a custom piece of engineering for a customer, that doesn't necessarily need to be open. But everything that pertains to the project needs to be open. The third, in my mind, is communication and discussion. So this is whether it's in Discourse or Slack or wherever you may have it, but conversation about how you're building the project should be out in the open too. The fourth one, which not everybody does, is road mapping. You know, some companies are really good at this. I think GitLab, completely open roadmaps, right? Not just that, like GitLab has like the company handbook is completely open, super open. So if you can have open road mapping, that's good because it gives your community a sense of where the project is moving forward. And often there's an open road mapping process that goes behind that. But not every project tends to do open road mapping, even if they don't have an open core model and separate products that are attached to it. But the top three should absolutely be open. The other one, the third piece, is peer-reviewed workflow. And again, this is subtle but important. It's pretty normal in open source projects that you have, you know, someone submits a pull request and it gets reviewed, and if a couple of developers are happy with it, it gets approved and then it gets merged into the master branch. But in many businesses, this is not the norm. There's very specific people who review people's work, and this happens privately. And the discussion of a branch never happens publicly. So if you've got developers in a company that are quite used to operating out in the open, it's pretty normal. Like when I was at Canonical, no one had an issue with this because everybody came from a background of building software out in the open. But if you've got a bunch of people who've come from Oracle and they're used to working internally, it's freaky. It's weird to be doing your work out in the open. So you've got to make sure that all of it happens out in the open, because if you have some of it happening privately and some of it happening publicly, again, you get that breakdown between the two different cultures. And most of what I'm talking about here is focused on the business. It's about the business putting in place the right underlying procedures and processes to make sure that you're operating in a fairly open way. And a lot of that will be training and guidance and support for your team members to do that. The fourth one, simple, accessible on-ramps. So what this is I'm generally of the view that one of the big challenges with communities is that a lot of people go out there and do a ton of outreach and promotion. We see a lot of people talking about developer relations and lots of conference travel and blogging and social media. And that's great for filling, to use a marketing term, filling the funnel and bringing people in. But when people get to your community and it's really difficult to set up the tool chain, the documentation's crap, you can't go and ask a question anywhere, it sucks. And all of that outreach is wasted because, again, to use a terrible marketing term, the people that are interested are not converting into contributors because it's too hard for them. So one of the reasons why I said earlier on that you need to pick your target audience as well is so you can design an on-ramp that's dead simple for them to use. So for example, if you want to attract inner developers, people to contribute to the open source project, not only do you need to make it easy for people to understand why they should come and participate, they need to be able to set their tool chain up easily. They need to be able to have, let's say, a simple tutorial for how they either fix their first bug, maybe some good first issue type bugs. But they also need to understand the code base and how it operates and how the peer review, like code review works, what CI/CD looks like, all of those different elements, all very specific to an inner developer. But for an outer developer, you need to make sure that it's just a very simple way of building something that sits on top of that platform. So on-ramps are really critical and really important. And I think another declaration of a project that's designed for contribution, because it's going to ease the number of people that come in. That's going to make the project more successful. And then potentially that's going to lead to your business being more successful. The second to last one is open communication channels and meetings. So one of the big challenges I see with a lot of open core businesses that are not doing it very well is they have a culture of internal employees tend to make decisions around water coolers and boardroom tables and bottles of kombucha, right? They sit down and they have private discussions. And then often that isn't communicated very well outside. It's not documented necessarily anywhere. So there becomes a bit of a divergence in terms of the public understanding of what's going on and the private agreement of what's going on. And that's a really bad situation to be in. The ideal scenario is no one's saying that absolutely everything has to happen in an issue or a pull request. But what should happen is if you do have a discussion, like if we all sat down here and made a decision about something, you should go and reflect the decision or the outcome of that discussion back into the issue or into the pull request. So what can ease this, because it's hard to do that, is to just try and have as many open communication channels and meetings as possible. So a good example of this is you may have a meeting about the open source project that primarily only staff members are really participating in. Maybe there's no community members. Have that communication channel open when you have that meeting. Do it in Slack, do it in IRC. Have it on a Google Hangout that's published. Because you're getting into the culture of just open discussion and collaboration. As far as I'm concerned, the private stuff should really only be for things that are specific to the company, where possible, or the exception being, like I said, security vulnerabilities, where you can't have a broader audience. Building a specific feature for a specific customer, where it's going to be used internally for them, that doesn't need to be out in the open. But if you're talking about a new feature that's going into the open project, that's something that should be out in the open. So formal meetings, again, was something we did consistently in Ubuntu. We had meetings all the time on IRC. The agenda was open, the notes were published publicly, and I think it gets the right healthy mindset. And then the final one here is avoiding code dumps. This is where you basically work on a piece of code for a long period of time, and then you just dump it into the community. This never works out well, because first of all, this is, again, I think where there's a cultural differentiation. The company often thinks, but hang on, I just paid a load of developers to build this thing, and what are they moaning about? But from the community's perspective, there's a view of, well, first of all, we didn't know this was a thing that you were working on. Secondly, this is a massive chunk of code that we have to go and now figure out how it works. And we need to figure out how to merge this whole thing into the project. It's much better to be able to break those larger features down into smaller chunks that go in bit by bit into the project instead of just dumping the whole thing. So try to avoid doing that. All right, 4. This is, to me, really critical. What is the relationship between the community and the company? And this, to me, is where most of the open core companies that are not doing a good job get it wrong, is that there isn't a clear cultural understanding between each other, from the company to understand how the community operates and the community that understands how the company operates. Now, the key thing to remember here is if you're the company, you're always going to have to work harder. And the reason for that is because you always have more information than the community will ever have. You know your employees who are working on the project. You know your customers. You may know some of the usual amounts of drama that's occurring in any open source community. You know these things, and the average community member won't know those things. They'll know the project, and they'll know everything that's available online. So as a company, it's incumbent on you to facilitate the right kind of collaboration and communication between the community and the company. You shouldn't look to your community to do that for you. So this is what I think is important here. The first thing is understanding the cultural norms of open source. And this in itself is complicated, right? How many people here have been involved in open source for over 10 years? Yeah, I thought so. I bet you couldn't put into words the culture of open source and what the cultural norms are. It's just difficult. We understand many of the consistent things around open discussion and collaboration and blah, 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 open licensing and all that kind of stuff. If you're brand new to a community, if you're brand new to open source, if you've started up a new business, that's an enormous amount of material to understand. And there's always an anxiety about putting your foot in your mouth and making mistakes. But you've got to do your best, I think, to understand those cultural norms. And sometimes those cultural norms will feel weird. This is one of the things that, again, I see with a lot of companies that come to me, is they're saying, we want to optimize how a community operates. And when we start talking through some of these tactical pieces around the repositories and the communication channels, often there's some blank stares that are like, well, we've never done that before. Well, if you want to make open core work, you're going to have to get used to making that happen. So understand those cultural norms and then communicate them expressly throughout your team members. In many companies, you'll have like a couple of engineers will get that, but what about your marketing team? What about your sales team? What about the COO? They need to also understand these cultural norms. And those cultural norms need to be communicated throughout the ranks. Your executives need to be able to say, our community, the open source project, is as critical to our success as the product. So Let's not just focus on the bottom line of making money. Let's focus on making the very best open source project that we can. And then the team can, as a whole, understand those cultural norms and communicate them out to the rest of the company. The second one is set an expectation about what participation looks like. And this is when you define your personas, the people you want to attract, say, what does that look like? Okay, specifically, when we want inner developers to participate, what kind of things do we want them to do? Do we want them to build features? Do we want them to fix bugs? You know, try to be as clear on that as possible and to make sure that you're able to support what that participation looks like. The third one I already touched a little bit earlier on, which is equalize community and staff participation as much as you can. I think this is one of the most critical elements of this, is that you're, especially when you've got, say, developers contributing to an open source project and staff members also contributing to that open source project, they need to feel like equals. Now, it's never going to be completely equal because someone's getting a salary and your community members are not going to get that. But you need to make sure that anyone who does the work is playing on the same playing field, whether it's people from different companies. A good example of that is something like Kubernetes, people from a wide variety of competing companies, all using the same approaches, the same infrastructure, the same processes, and that's one of the reasons why that project's successful. So again, companies need to be intentional in setting that up. Providing training and incentives for staff members. When you have people who understand open source intrinsically, it's easier to build an open core project, but you're only going to have that for so long, and then you're going to have to start hiring people who've got no idea about open source. They're brand new to it, or they have less experience. So identifying what is the kind of behavior that you want to see, such as open discussion, open collaboration, participating in open meetings and governance, and you want to make sure you've got the right incentives for that. So when you see that kind of positive behavior, you can reward those staff members so they know they're on the right path, but also your other staff members can see that's the kind of behavior we should be focusing on. Now, the flip side is for your community members, recognizing and rewarding active community participation. If you've got people who are coming to your community and they are organizing events, they're writing documentation, they're writing code, they're actively moving the project forward, it's really important to identify and recognize that and reward it as much as you can. And I even like to get down to the atomic level. The first time someone makes a contribution to your project in any of your defined areas, how do you recognize it? And it can be as simple as getting an email from you that says, thank you. You know, it's people like you that make our project tick. I did this with a client recently, where anyone who submits their first pull request that gets merged in, they get an email from the CEO. And it's amazing how much that works for them. Yeah? So the question is that an automatic email that comes from them, or is it personal? It's what I call a submarine incentive, which is what you use a computer to detect it, to detect that they made that contribution that was merged in. Never have a computer send that email. Otherwise, it's really cheesy and unclassy. So that email, they'd be notified, hey, this person contributed, and then that person would send like a little personal email. So, but it doesn't have to be sending them T-shirts and swag and all that kind of stuff that people often waffle on about. A private email often can be worth it. Don't funnel all engagement through a community manager. This is a little bit of a bugbear for me. It's amazing how many companies go out and hire a community manager who's fabulous at what they do, and then the company staff members think, okay, if we're going to talk to the community, we'll just talk to Sarah and she can deal with the community. And this is a bad idea for lots of reasons. One of the main reasons is it doesn't scale. Sarah is going to run out of time at some point. But the other thing is, your community members don't want to just talk to Sarah. They want to talk to you too. So the more you can connect your staff members to your community, the better. And you'll get a better outcome. You'll get a more personal set of relationships that are forming. So Sarah can be a facilitator, making sure that the staff have got the right kind of training and support, and they know what to do, and they know how much time they should be doing it. Make sure that it is spread throughout the organization. Again, companies that don't do a good job with this, they don't have any interaction between the company and the project beyond a small set of engineers. And then the final one, never, ever, ever, ever spam users or sell their information. This company will go unnamed, but I've been working with a client now for about 6 or 7 months, and I found out a couple of weeks ago that they did precisely this. Just to a couple of people, but they had some people joining up on their forum and participating. Nice little community that's forming. And then they had their sales team reach out to them. This is just an objectively terrible thing to do. It breaks enormous levels of trust between the community members and the company. So you've got to set very clear guardrails in place. You've got to say to your sales team, you're not allowed near any of these people, okay? You're not allowed to reach out to developers directly. Any marketing towards this group of people has to be very tightly controlled. Developers do not like to be marketed by, especially by traditional marketers. So you need to make sure that if you want to engage with people, it's done in a really direct, authentic manner. It's never mailing lists and spam and sales funnels, all of that kind of stuff. Never do that. All right, 5. Building strong, dependable trust and relationships. To me, what makes open core when it succeeds work is because there is a fundamental level of trust between the project and the product, or the people who build the product. It's the company and the people involved. And there, again, I'd use GitLab as an example of this. Like, there's a really healthy relationship between contributors in the GitLab ecosystem and the company. And one of the reasons for that with GitLab is that GitLab has designed their business around essentially everything that I'm talking about here. Everything's out in the open, completely remote working organization, completely open processes. Are GitLab perfect? No. But they're a damn sight better than a lot of other companies that do this. So I think understanding how we build trust is really important. And again, a lot of companies that are new to this don't really know how about doing that. So the first thing is you need to be intentional about having a diverse, high-quality community experience. In the same way that product managers will sit around for hours saying, how do we perfect the onboarding experience for the first 10 minutes of a product? You know, or how do we perfect the advertising funnel? Or how do we perfect the sales process? So they carve out this really, really efficient way of working based upon prior experimentation and data and analytics and all this kind of stuff. So you can say that this is absolutely rock solid. You need that for your community members. You need to look at your community members in the same way that you look at your Facebook advertising funnel. How do we drive efficiency? How do we experiment with copy? How do we experiment with imagery? How do we make their experience as good as possible? Because when you do that, when you're intentional about it, and you focus on diversity, which is not just diversity of gender and sexuality and all that kind of stuff, but also diversity of participation and contribution, when you're intentional about it, by definition, you make a better open source project and a better set of trust and relationships. The other element here is to be able to engage with your key contributors. Again, like a lot of companies who are new at this just don't know what that looks like. What does a key contributor mean? Is it people writing code? How much code do they have to write? How often do they have to write code? So be clear about what that means, and then engage with them. And it doesn't have to be through bulk emails. It can be just going out for coffee with somebody at an event. It can be just dropping them an email to thank them. It can be asking them how they're doing, you know, what hobbies they have. It's building a relationship. And when your community is small, you can do this. You can know everybody. It gets harder when you get bigger, but that's a different set of challenges. And the other element to this is incentivizing mentoring and trust building. You want your staff and your community members to support the success of other people. So, you know, another example is another client of mine. They have these two people who work in their engineering team who don't just kind of write code and contribute to the project, but they're absolutely explicit about providing support. They're always asking questions in the forum. They kicked off some mentoring initiatives. They kicked off some diversity initiatives, these two people. And they're incredible. And their company has really rewarded them quite significantly. One of them got a promotion. The other person is recognized all the time in kind of company-wide emails and all the rest of it. And what's happening is that psychologically, we mimic our leaders. So other people are now mimicking that kind of mentoring behavior. But again, we need to be intentional in doing so. Most people don't wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to go and mentor someone. So I think if you have programs in place to do that, especially staff mentoring community members, by definition, you're going to get some better results. I mentioned events here. Deliver events to bring the community and staff together. I think this is really important. And part of the reason why I think this is because we used to run the Ubuntu Developer Summit every 6 months for many years. And many fond memories of that event, and they were really productive, lots of work got done. But one of the most important elements is that we got to hang out with each other. You know, and that doesn't mean going down the pub, that just means having coffee, having lunch with each other, getting to know each other and your families and your friends and your hobbies and all the rest of it. You just cannot do that very well online. You can get to know each other in Slack and have conversations, but getting people in the same room is critical. And part of the reason why I'm putting events on is we decided to move from in-person to online with the Ubuntu Developer Summit. Didn't work. Disaster. Like, we had some reasonable discussions and sessions and some results and some valuable content, but it was nowhere near as valuable as the in-person sessions. But your events don't have to be like the Ubuntu Developer Summit with 600 people and 50 community members flown from all over the world. It can be getting 20 or 30 people together. It can be doing multiple smaller events, but you've got to get people together. And it was particularly important for the staff and the community members. One of the reasons I think this is important as well is when you organize these events, a lot of companies tend to cherry pick the choir that they like to sing to. They bring out the most favorable community members and the most supportive community members. You want to bring out the people who are most critical of what you do as well. I've used him as an example in the past. I know he doesn't mind me saying this, but there was a guy called Scott Ritchie who was involved in the Ubuntu community who was very vocally critical of a lot of the stuff that we did. But Scott was always respectful and dignified and just a good guy to be around. He came to every single Ubuntu Developer Summit. We flew out to all of them because his criticism was important, and you want that. So you don't want just to have an echo chamber when you have those events. And then the final one here is plan for a measured, reasonable response to criticism. You're going to have criticism. There's going to be people in your community that are going to be upset about things, especially when you have an open core project. Because some people are going to feel like, well, maybe the decisions that were made in the product were bad decisions, and it might reflect on the project, or vice versa. So you've got to make sure that when this criticism happens, and in many cases, it can be stinging, and it can be uncomfortable, and it's public. And most people are not used to dealing with stinging criticism in a public forum very well. But the most critical thing here in my mind is to be measured and understanding and stoic in how you handle this. And that's hard to do in the moment, so prepare for it. It sounds ridiculous, but practice it. Have someone who you know be critical about something, and practice how you're going to respond. Be a listener. Try to understand what the core issue is and how you're going to reflect it and how you're going to respond to it. This is how you build great trust. In many cases, the trust is tested in the most intense way in those periods of disagreement and how you respond to them. And then the final one is around open, accessible, and inclusive leadership. So every project has some form of leadership. In some projects, like KDE, for example, there's not really any leadership. There's a formal governance body like KDEB, but the vast majority of the decision-making just gets done by developers in terms of what goes into KDE. In other projects like Linux, you get specific people like Linus Torvalds at the top and Greg Kerr-Hartman, who are making decisions at the subsystem layer. And in other projects like Debian, you've got a technical board, and you've got a community council, and all these other pieces. So it's important to think about what that looks like for you. I think it's important to just have a clear level of governance for that project. And that might be incredibly lightweight. It might be, maybe we have just a community council with a specific set of people who have a specific focus on just community policy. I'm going to use Ubuntu as another example here. There were two primary, and still are, two primary boards in Ubuntu. The community council is on community policy and decision-making around things like how do you become an Ubuntu member. And then the technical board is just technical policy. No one makes a decision about what goes into Ubuntu. The developers make the decisions about what goes into Ubuntu in the project. Those boards are set up to make a determination around policy. And the codification is very clear about that. And I would always say, start as simple as you can. There are some projects like we should have three different, a technical steering committee and a governance board. We should have a community council, and we should have working groups. No, just start really simple. Add additional layers of governance as you need them. I think it's also critical that you base your leadership on active participation. And this kind of leads to the second point here. So the term there's a term meritocracy in open source, and it's a pretty controversial term. And one of the reasons for that is that, years ago, people would often talk about how open source was a meritocracy, that those people who did the work got recognition because of the work that they did, and it wasn't because of any other elements. But one of the flaws with the term meritocracy is that it presumes that everyone's playing on an equal playing field, and everybody isn't playing on an equal playing field. So while many of the decisions made in open source and recognition in open source is because of what people are doing, it's also important to recognize that not everybody is starting from the same position. But as a general rule, I think you want to make sure that when you have leadership in a project, it is based upon the content of what they've done. You don't want to just have leadership because somebody works for a company, where possible. Now, in the beginning of many open core projects, you'll have precisely that because there isn't anybody else. When you start a new project and your company's building it, everybody who's working on it is an employee. And that's fine. But I think you want to get to a point where the project can stand on its own 2 feet. I gave this example when I was having a few beers earlier on with some friends about the Gates Foundation. They have a project called Loop that I've been doing some work with, which is a financial services platform to bring financial inclusiveness to large parts of Africa. And it's a really neat project. It's going to have a massive impact, especially on women and entrepreneurs across those different regions in Africa. And the way the Gates Foundation works is they said, we're bootstrapping this, we're putting a ton of money into this, we're hiring people to work on this, we're working with other partners and paying them. But after about 3 years, you've got to stand on your own 2 feet. You've got to be able to find your own people to participate, and there's got to be a healthy ecosystem around this, And I think it's important to be able to have that for your open core project as well, to say, we may be bootstrapping this, but we want to make this a really independent ecosystem. And this kind of leads to the next piece here, is to limit and ideally avoid specific project privileges for commercial entities. The one thing where there's a lot of debate around this is pay-to-play board seats. I'm generally of the view that if you're, for example, a member, and you're paying a certain amount of money to be a member in a foundation or an organization, people are going to expect something for their money, and I get that. And I think there's nothing wrong with being on an advisory board or something such as that. But as a general rule for the open source project, you want to make sure that the people who are in a leadership position have earned it. And just spending money is not necessarily earning it. So you can give people value from, for example, being members of a foundation in lots of other ways, training, conferences, feeding into input into technical steering committees and advisory boards and all this kind of stuff. But when it comes to the core leadership of that project, in my mind, it needs to be as objectively defined as possible. It could be anybody. And the good news is if you base it on participation, then generally you're going to have the right people in there, because it's going to be the people who are working on the project that everybody knows are the people who are going to have earned their way into it. The next one is define clear policy, especially with the product-project bridge. And what I mean by that is, in fact, Jeremy, just before we came in here, used this as an example. Like, what happens if somebody creates a feature in the open source project that mirrors a feature in the commercial product? And many open core projects kind of face this question. My view is this, and it's a term that I learned from my father-in-law: I'd rather disappoint you now than in 6 months. And I think here it's about being clear up front. I think it's okay to say that features can be contributed to this project, covering anything, so long as it meets the needs of the maintainers and whatever decision making they're having. And if you need to say, but features that are in this particular commercial product will not be accepted, I'd rather you say that and avoid the uncertainty that someone spends a ton of work building one of those features, submitting it for inclusion, then it gets rejected because of an unwritten assumption or rule that you have. That's a terrible outcome for that person if they spent a ton of time building that. That's going to increase the likelihood of concern and criticism and potentially the risk of forking as well. So that's what I mean by I'd rather disappoint you now than in 6 months. Set your expectations as clearly as possible up front. It might limit the number of people who come into your project, but you're going to be much clearer in stating what's going to be happening. The other thing here with governance and leadership, just a couple more, is operating openly and transparently. So if you have a couple of governing boards in a project, for example, it's important to make sure that your meetings are out in the open, that the notes from those meetings are out in the open, that the nominations process for how you get those people into those governing boards is open. Okay, you don't want there to be private backroom dealings like in Washington, D.C. for how people get into these governance boards. The whole point of this is that it's open and transparent. There is one exception to this. Every governing board needs to have a private place to discuss issues that are not suitable for public consumption. So, for example, there may be, I'll give you an example. There was a project that I was having a conversation with about 3 weeks ago where a member of the community has been demonstrating concerning behavior and potentially suicidal behavior. You cannot have a conversation about that individual on a public mailing list. It's completely inappropriate. So you need to have a place where you can have those sensitive discussions, but you have those private discussions in as limited a form as possible. You want to make sure that generally you're out in the open. And the final one here is just avoid setting up a new foundation. We've got enough foundations in the world. And also setting up foundations is hard and it's expensive. It looks easy, but it isn't. So where possible, if you've got a project that you want to get into a foundation because you want, for example, a place to put your intellectual property and a level playing field for different companies to work together, go and look at one of the existing foundations, whether it's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Apache, the Eclipse Foundation, wherever it might be. It's better to work within an existing structure than to set up yet another foundation. I guarantee you it's going to be more painful than you expect. So just wrapping up, this to me is one of the most critical slides in this whole deck. One of the things that bothers me about Open Core right now is that people are forming into their own tribes about this. There are people who are saying Open Core is terrible, it's a bad thing for open source, and there are people who are saying this is basically the only way in which we can make money, so this is the way we're going to do it. Everybody's right and everybody's wrong. We're all learning. I've been in open source now for 22 years. I don't have all the answers by any stretch. Many of you have been in this for more than 10 years. You don't have all the answers. We're constantly figuring this stuff out. And the way in which we learn and the way in which we figure this out is to do it together instead of forming into packs that fight each other on Twitter. So my hope is that as people head into the discussion of Open Core in the next couple of years, that it's from a position of learning, that there are going to be some bad examples and some bad mistakes that are made, but let's extract the value for that to understand it. And let's make sure that it's not a panacea. I don't think Open Core is going to solve all problems. It is risky. There's a lot of potential issues with it. But let's discuss those issues and see if there's workarounds around it. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. One final thing, go buy my book. So there it is. All right. Thank you, everyone. Any questions before we finish up? I know it's late, and I'm standing between the bar and I. Yes?
The product is probably going to have some requirements that are going to have to be reflected in the project. And in fact, you built the project because you want a particular product.
Right.
I don't know how to ask this, but I can see a whole lot of ways for this to become a pain point with the community developers.
Right.
Probably know a lot more than I do about it.
Probably not. So you're talking about, I know I keep coughing. I promise you I haven't got coronavirus. I'm just getting over a flu. You're talking about how do you broach the fact that you might need features that in the open source project that are required for the product. Yeah. To me, the critical thing here is even if the only people who are contributing to the open source project are your staff members, let's say you've completely bootstrapped the project yourself, that you still operate in an open and a transparent way in how you go about presenting those requirements. You don't just kind of like push them through. And it might seem like unnecessary busy work, but I think it's better for someone to say, okay, we want to build this feature, and we're going to need these dependencies in the project. So maybe kick off an issue and say, I'd like to have a conversation with the broader project group about if this makes sense, if this is something that's suitable for inclusion, and then maybe put together a pull request as one first piece of it to kickstart that discussion, and then gradually, as I mentioned, break it into pieces and get it through. So what you're doing is you're not just making a pull request and submitting it into the master branch. You're having the open discussion and discourse around whether this is appropriate for the public project. Even if it's just staff members, even if you know everybody's going to say yes, because what you're doing is you're socializing people around the process. Then when other people do come in, and your staff members are used to going through that way of proposing inclusion of a feature and having a conversation about it, it also means that if someone wants to push back and says, no, this doesn't make any sense, they've got to have a good rationale behind it. It's not just about, a lot of companies will be worried about someone canning what you need because they don't want it. But if they do that, they've got to have a good rationale, a justifiable reason why it shouldn't be included as well, and not just a rationale for why it should be included. So I'd go that route, and then 9 times out of 10 you can get what you need through. So.
If they've got a justified rationale for not having this thing in the open source project, the only reason it needs to be in there is because the commercial product needs it.
Right.
Are you of the opinion that a company should go, oh, you say we're not allowed to do it, so we won't? Because I've never seen that. Companies tend to go, yeah, we listen to your opinion, but really, we own this stuff, so it's going in.
Right. I think it's rare that happens, first of all, because a lot of the commercial products that are behind, that sit on top, are usually completely separate code bases that usually will talk to the open source project either they'll just be built on top of it, or they'll through an API. So it doesn't happen very often, but I agree with you. Like, look, people are people, and there's a high likelihood that someone's going to say, nah, we're getting it through, To me, this is the thing about open core is it's never going to be perfect. You've just got to get it good enough that you can protect the right culture on both sides. And there's always going to be, just like with politics, there's always going to be people who are doing it in a way that they shouldn't be doing it. To me, it's about having as much of the right kind of structure as possible. And then when people do make bad choices, I think it's reasonable to pull them up on it and say, you know what, you shouldn't have done that. I use Canonical as a couple of examples. There were some objectively bad decisions that we made at Canonical in pushing things into the project. And hindsight has taught me we probably shouldn't have done some of that. So, I think you've got to do the best that you can. You're not allowed to talk, Ted. Any other questions?
I think these are all good practices, but don't follow them. For instance, I use the Rails or Linux published E052A. But yet, widely people say that it's the greatest open source project ever. How do projects end up an exception on these things? And what are your thoughts on that? Because there's lots of projects we use as examples.
Yeah. This is kind of what I meant at the beginning when I said there's no one way to do this. Like, to me, I'm confident enough in what I've presented here that I think if people did implement a lot of this, their chances of having a healthy open core project will be significantly improved. But there's always going to be cases where, for various reasons, people can't do this. They might not have the resources to do it. There'll just be internal pushback. Like, a lot of this stuff will be hard to deliver if you're, a bank. There's just limitations in what you can do. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's a bad project. What I would argue is the community should be always lobbying for as much of an open infrastructure as possible. And then there's got to be a level of discussion between what you can reasonably accomplish. So you may not get, for example, the QA infrastructure that's out there, and they may give you various reasons for that, like we can't do that for security reasons or this, that, and the other. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole project is in flames, but I think that can then trigger the right kind of conversation of, okay, if we can't get all the QA there, how much of it can we get there? Or how can we reorientate what we've already got to get some of it there? So to me, this is where there's like a negotiation. The big problem, I think, is when companies feel like they are by definition in control of the project. And when you are the company that's kicked it off, like HashiCorp is a good example. They kicked off Vault. They are in charge of Vault, and that's always going to be the case. But they've designed an environment where people can have an equal level of participation where possible. So I think accepting that balance of power is important, and then, but always having a continued discussion, how do we make it better? Any other questions? Yeah.
Communication channels are actually something we struggle with. We want to have, like you said, equal footing in terms of having information available
Yeah.
to both the community and employees. I don't know how, I haven't figured out how to do that other than using two separate tool sets. I mean, even if it's Slack, we'll have one instance that's public and one
Right.
instance that's behind the firewall, so to speak. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the optimal way to do it, or I don't know if you've seen other ways, other communities do it differently.
The general philosophy that I've got is, and I think this is easier to apply with Open Core, is for all discussion and communication that relates to the project, the open source project, where possible you want to have that all out in the open. So again, Canonical, we struggle with this at Canonical. And the general policy was, and I was pretty proud of how the team, across the entire Ubuntu team did this, was that, for example, if you wanted to talk about something that was going to go into Ubuntu, you talked about it in Ubuntu Devel. Like, that's where you did it. And there was kind of an internal culture of snootiness. So if you had a conversation within an internal channel that was really designed for an external channel, someone would, within a few minutes, say, well, let's take this to Ubuntu Devel to talk about it. So I think you'll always need channels that are private and confidential for the company. That's perfectly normal. To me, it's about, this is where it's a policy issue, is you say everything that is about the project should be out in the public channels where possible. And then training the team members and incentivizing the team members around that, and making it clear that the team's got to enforce that. It's not like you can have one person that's going to be just monitoring these channels and say, that was inappropriate that you talked about that privately, go to this other channel. Like in Ubuntu, it was all the developers that were doing that. But I think you're always going to have that separation. I find that the number of internal channels from most companies can be relatively limited. And a lot of the conversation will probably be happening out in the public channel. So, any other questions? No? I think we're done. Thank you, everyone.